At this point, to get it healthy, usually I'll start with something high in nitrogen. Usually at the nursery we use Harrell's. You know, it's like a grass fertilizer. It's very high in nitrogen. It boosts them up real quick. But even Harrell's has some drawbacks. So I'll even put Harrell's on and also organic fertilizer. Okay? Organic fertilizer gets a bad rap as being slow. Organic fertilizer is the only true fertilizer that's constant feeding every time you water. So even the ones that you buy, Osmocote and all that, that say they're constant feed, they're not. They feed in stages. So they have actual different layers, like a gumball, where they have a protection that it'll dump the fertilizer for a month and then stop for a month, and then dump for a month and then stop for a month as you water through. So it's not a constant feed. And down the road, when we get into refinement, that's going to be very important that we know when we're feeding the tree. Okay? So that's going to be how we control and refine the branches. All right, so the first thing I would do, obviously, is fertilize it. And then I would wait. And now I know, being in wintertime, that I'm not going to see much growth. And this is just from doing this for so long. I know that I'm probably going to have to wait until spring to really see this thing start to push out. So I'm not going to do anything until I see that. Okay? The next thing I'm going to do, the next priority, is the roots, not the top. The top is the last priority. My next thing is get the roots as healthy as possible. Now, this is going to open a can of worms, okay, because we're going to talk about soil, all right? It doesn't matter what soil you use, okay? It is really all technique. But there are soils out there that will make your life easier if you don't have the best technique. I don't have the best technique. There's guys in Indonesia that grow in mud that have way better technique than I do. So I need help. So what do I use? For healthy roots, a common soil is pumice, lava, and akadama. But that's also really, the akadama is really better for refining trees. And in Florida, akadama can be tricky to use if you're a heavy waterer, because it breaks down, and some trees do not like that decomposed root ball. Some trees do love it. So what I would do for this olive, knowing what it likes, is I would probably pot it into a mix that has a lot less akadama, and probably more on the lava side, just so I could keep it as porous as possible, because unlike the guy that I got this from in California, where he never gets rain, and he can water his tree once every 7 days, we get rain in the rainy season 4 inches a day. So that soil's not going to work for us. It's super fine. And you can see, so I need to know when I'm starting a new tree to assess problems that haven't even occurred yet. So I have a plan. I already have a plan for this tree. And this is one of the best ways to get to a successful bonsai, is to make sure that you formulate a plan and you say, okay, this is what I'm going to do and when. Okay? Now this sounds really heavy stuff, and as we all know, who have been doing bonsai for a little bit, it doesn't have to be this complicated. But how many of us get to a point where we're like, how do I make this tree better? You know, we get to that point where, okay, we've hit the plateau. And if you're still interested in bonsai and you still are interested in that tree, then you want to know, okay, what do I do next? All right? So horticulture in Japan, #1 aspect of a bonsai. You could show a tree that has the greatest deadwood, the greatest design, and if it's unhealthy, it doesn't mean anything. Nothing. The word specimen explains it all. A specimen is a version of whatever you're displaying at its very best. That's a specimen, showing the best qualities of it. So when we show a specimen bonsai, it needs to show all the best qualities of that species, the health. Okay? When I started working with these Japanese artists, I quit falling in love with these fun little designs and things like that, and my first love became seeing a happy tree. And all of a sudden I was like, oh my God, this is what bonsai is all about. You know, it's growing a happy tree first, and then once we have our happy tree, how do we make that happy tree better? You know? So this guy's got about another year of development left, and then he's going to be moved to refinement. Refinement means he'll be potted in an appropriate pot, and we'll be turning the vigor off. All right? No more development. We don't want shooting long branches. We want to start building tight-knit internodes and build as many branches as we can, and we want to have slow, controlled growth. Fast growth is not good for refinement. So you won't see a lot of Chinese elms grown in Japan. One of the reasons that it's very hard to slow that growth down. Okay? slow growth and refinement is very, very good, very, very useful. So once we get into refinement, that can take anywhere from 2 to 3 years as well, depending on the tree. Okay? Now, shohin trees, this is why these are so cool, is these cut the time by a lot. All right, a shohin tree, let's say you develop it for 2 years and refine it for 1 year. You have a high quality finished tree in 3 years. Okay? So, very, very cool to get into those as well. So let's move this guy down. The next one we're going to talk about is Premna, because these are all trees we're going to be working on. All right, these are all the trees we're going to be working on. So the next one is Premna. Now this is something that may seem at this point almost like there's tons of them everywhere. This is like a tree that's so grown in Florida, they're everywhere. That was not always the case. This was a tree that I used to drool over in magazines and books, and they just didn't exist in the United States. And then one day, Pedro Morales went to Taiwan and brought back cuttings, brought back 2 trees that we took cuttings from, of the Premna and the sea hibiscus, and he did that with other nurseries too, but all these have grown from that initial cutting, okay, the sea hibiscus and the Premnas. So this is something that, at this point, we see a ton of them, but this is still a very, very special, amazing, and unique tropical. So that's one of the reasons why I'm glad they chose it to kind of continue the class on. Premna developed very, very quickly. One of these guys, actually, let's do this. One of these guys I made a lot of mistakes on. 2 of these guys I've kind of learned from my mistakes. This guy has been grown for 1 year. 1 year. This guy for 2 years, and this one for 5 years.
Can you move the big one?
Yes, I'm sorry.
No. The one that wasn't talking.
This one?
Yeah. Thanks.
No worries. So this is a nice tree. This is a very nice, I like it. It's actually one of my favorite little trees that I have.
Explain the 2-pot thingy.
Oh, hang on, Catherine. Get into that.
Sorry.
Slow down. So this is one that I've been working on for a lot longer than these other 2. And as you can see, this tree has a lot more branching and is a lot more developed. I've been spending so much time and effort trying to get the vigor back to this tree so that I can get it to look like this tree, and it's very, very difficult. Okay? One of the ways you have to get vigor back is you have to stop working on your tree. Just let it grow out. We hate doing that. I know it sucks, but that's what you have to do. So, these guys were cuttings. Okay, cuttings. This was stuff that was literally going to be thrown in the trash. And so in 1 year, I took a cutting doing this technique of development, refinement, and whatnot, and this was 1 year from cutting. So it's not a world-class tree yet, but that's a long way to go for a year. Every single branch on this tree was grown. Every single root on this tree was grown in 1 year. So it's very, very quick. And that's from knowing, running branches out, building up the gas, and then knowing when to cut. Okay?
Put your cuttings in regular soil.
I usually do, just because it's a little easier to root them. So both of these were going to be thrown in the trash. The other aspect of this, too, is wound healing. So this guy I kind of did before I really realized the importance of healing the wounds properly. Healing the wounds on a tree that's grown increases your value tenfold of the tree. I mean, it really does. It just increases the impact of it, erasing the artist's hand, okay? Anybody who has a little bit of experience in bonsai can pick up this tree, and this will be the exact reaction. They'll look at it and be like, wow, that's a really cool tree. Oh, I see how you did that. You know, it takes away from it. It's a better tree if they're like, wow, where did he make the cut? And how did he grow that? That's a true sealed dwarf tree. So it's very, very important. So that's another reason why you keep things in development and run branches. You run them out. There's also a physiological reason. Trees grow a certain way in nature. Taper on real trees in nature has a logical sense to it. It gets thinner where there's thinner branching. It gets bigger where there's larger branches pulling away. So the taper has logic to it. So that's the other thing. So now this tree's almost done with development. All right? What I could have done, there's no special rule that says, all right, here's where you end development. But what I could have done to make this tree better was maybe add another year of development to thicken the primary branches. Now this can be a rabbit hole though, because I know people and friends who are in perpetual development. The tree will never leave development because they'll never be happy with it. It's never ready to go to refinement yet. So there does come a point where you have to stop yourself and say, okay, we're moving to refinement. Right? I have the tree, it's going to get better, and so on and so forth. So here's a few of these cuttings. This is kind of how I start these trees. Very humble beginnings. The trees I've grown from cutting, I will tell you, far outweigh the trees I took them from. They really do. These ones haven't yet. This is not even a year in. I did these guys really late in the season, probably September, so they were really late to root cuttings. But the first thing I did as soon as they rooted was put wire on them and get a bend in them. Okay? The same with the sea hibiscus cutting. Okay? So these will be trees that hopefully will surpass the tree that I took them from. So that's the other thing, is to take as many cuttings as possible and make the trees from scratch, because then you have oversight over all the flaws. You don't have to worry about roots coming from areas where you didn't have oversight over the growth of the tree. You have complete oversight. So now the next one, Ficus nerifolia. I should also add that every single one of these trees, except for my olive, is a tropical. And all of these tropicals hate being in weather under 55 degrees. Okay? Before I get into the next one, I want to point out that this Melina looks way worse than this Melina. Okay? You see that?
Yeah.
So they both live in Florida. So what's going on? Melinas do not like temperatures under 55 degrees. And while this tree is not going to die, and while this tree is okay, it certainly doesn't look good, and it's certainly not happy. Okay? So what's the easiest way to keep that tree happy?
Keep it warm.
Keep it warm. Bring it in. Bring your trees in. It can be a pain in the butt, but I promise you it will save you so much headache. If you can keep the tree happy throughout all of winter, then by the time spring comes, you'll be growing right off the bat. You won't lose any time.
Do you use a heat pad at all?
You could. I mean, so the name of the game here is temperature equilibrium. You want to keep it consistent. So you don't want to be doing these huge fluctuations. Okay, that's where trees start to have issues. So I bring them in all the time. And what that allows me to do is do work that I normally wouldn't be able to do this time of year. So I've taken cuttings just a few weeks ago, and I just have to remember those will take as long as I bring them in every time it gets that low, every night. It's kind of a pain, but I brought that on myself by doing the work late.
You bring them right in the house,
Right in the house.
not just.
How many are you talking about?
Well, I cherry pick. Okay, not everybody deserves to come in the house. So no, my best of the best, and I kind of weigh it on my mood. I'm like, does the nerifolia really need to come in? It'll be fine. So, but you will be better off bringing it in. So here's a good example of a nerifolia that's been brought in here and one that hasn't been brought in. And so you can see even the nerifolia shows a big difference in the foliage density and happiness. It's even more apparent on Premna in that these are Premna that have been brought in, nice green canopy, and these are Premna that have been left out.
Can you cover them like with a sheet or something
You can't.
lightweight?
You can, and that's iffy. So the best thing always is keeping them consistent temperature. Now, if obviously that can't work for every tree. If your tree is this enormous, you're not bringing it indoors, which is why I work on ShoFu. So, no, so covering them, putting a heat pad in, covering them with plastic, whatever you can do. And especially for those of us that do get frost, you got to keep frost off your trees. So a blanket at least does that. Okay?
So when you say consistent temperature, then you're saying ideally, if you were in a perfect world, it would stay at a consistent temperature all year.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. So, and that's just for us. That's not talking about like a deciduous maple tree that has to have that deciduous cycle. Okay?
Right.
We're talking about trees that are evergreen trees, broadleaf trees, tropicals that would do better, that are always growing when it warms up and then going dormant when it's not. A rain tree is a good example of that.
Yeah.
When it warms up, like when we have these days where we're at 86 degrees, almost 90 degrees, those rain trees wake up and they're pushing again. Then we get a 50-degree day and it's back down to, I'm not doing anything. So that's a tree that wakes up and grows, goes back to sleep. Wakes up, grows, goes back to sleep. So those are things that would benefit by not going to sleep,
Okay.
you know? So bringing the trees in. You can see these Premnas, the Molinas, don't look great, and that's from just leaving them out. And again, this isn't going to hurt the tree or kill the tree, because we haven't been that cold. But when we get to refinement, that's going to cost you big time. Because one of the biggest things is we're always wondering, where's all my branching going? Well, it's dying back when it gets cold. It's dying back when it gets too shaded out. It's dying back when it doesn't have the fertilizer it needs. There's little things that we just forget to do that we set ourselves back the next year. Okay? So it's just, if you're on a regimen, you're on a routine, it's not a big deal. I have people who tell me, well, I forgot to water my trees the other day. I understand that, but if you want the result that we see in the books, that you see in Japan and whatnot, they treat their trees like animals. Like, you wouldn't forget to water your dog. You wouldn't forget to feed your dog. That would be so ingrained in your mind, you get home and you do it. And that's the same thing with bonsai. If you really, really want it, you'll get it. You know? Otherwise, if you don't provide for the tree, it's going to decline and you're not going to see the results you want, and you won't get the tree you want. So you can't just do the fun part of bonsai and just have all the good parts. Okay? Got to do the part, the crummy work. So
what do you do in the summer, as far as the opposite? You're saying, well, it's cold in the winter and I bring my babies in. So in the summer and it's super hot, one of those days it's just blistering hot. What do you do something different?
do, absolutely. Every tree is different, and there's a lot of trees that don't want to be in blistering heat.
Right.
I have a Japanese gardenia. Those of you who have been following me for a while know I have this gardenia tree. This tree loves full sun until about June. Then it's too hot for it. Does not, so I move it to the shade. I put it to partial shade. It helps maintain the moisture level, and I don't have an issue with it. Then come fall, I put it back out in the full sun. Winter, it goes into full sun, it's fine. If we get too cold, I bring it in. So bonsai is, again, problem solving. It's a lot of problem solving. Once you kind of understand the physiology, and you're like, okay, I understand how this tree works, then you can be like, all right, I see my problem. How can I correct this? Because there's a lot of ways to correct it. There's a lot. Like I was saying, there's a lot of different soils. There's a lot of different things. So, like, this is a great example. The guy in California can water his tree once every 7 days. We can't do that here because we have a different problem set. We have a different set of issues.
So how often do you water them?
Right now, I water it about every 7 days, but I know coming in rainy season, I'm not going to have that luxury. And so that's why my primary goal, probably around May, is to really switch that out for coarser mix. Okay, so I'm anticipating an issue before it
Now
happens.
you do it every 7 days?
I'm sorry. Yeah, right now, about every 7 days. But it's in super fine. You guys can come up and look at it when you get a chance.
Oh, you mean that particular tree?
Exactly. So a lot of it is knowing the species of tree. Knowledge is power. So I know that this is an olive tree. It doesn't like a ton of water. It's an arid-loving tree. So I know it's in fine soil mix. I know we're in winter, so it's not growing a lot. It's not using a lot of water. So I know I have all these variables working against me, and that helps me take a path, helps me choose when to water it. I'm like, all right, well, I think you can go one more day. Juniper's another one. I know it's not going to drop all the needles if I underwater it this time of year. I'll have a sign if I see that I'm underwatering, I can correct the issue. So I'd rather err on that side of the caution, err on the side of underwatering. So if this was in an organic soil, I'd even pull back even more probably. So it all just determines on, it's all determined on the soil you're in, the foliage you have, the time of year, the wind, all that stuff. And it sounds silly, but it sounds like we're weighing a lot of variables at one time, but it becomes second nature. I walk out in the morning, I check the weather. I'm like, oh, today's gonna be really windy, high of 86. Oh man, it's dark when I go out to water my trees. So I come out, I make a game plan. I'm like, all right, yesterday this tree was staying too wet, this tree was too wet, this needed more water, and then so I do that accordingly. I water this one more, barely hit this one, barely hit that one. If there's anything that's precarious spot, I move it down because I checked about wind, and this becomes just a routine, just like anything. So, yeah.
So, talk a little bit about water, because a lot of us are using city water, and it might not be the best for some of these?
So water quality is kind of a pain in the butt. Not everybody gets the best quality water. Now, you'll see that affect trees to varying degrees. You can see on the trees that we got from Eric right now, our water quality is not great either, especially in the winter. One of the issues we have in the winter is that everything is becoming concentrated. So all the things that we're feeding from, all these aquifers and groundwater, is basically concentrating these minerals because we haven't had any rain. As far as any other water quality, the only thing you can really do is buy distilled water, collect rainwater, or just deal with the fact that you have city water. Get a purifier. But in reality, usually if you can keep the vigor up on a tree and keep it healthy, it should be able to overcome issues like that.
You don't want a softener, do you?
I have not experimented with that.
Sodium's really.
Sodium.
Yeah.
So sodium is really rough on trees too. Sodium is one of the biggest killers when we over-fertilize our plants too.
Oh, yeah. That's full of
So
salt.
going back to fertilizer real quick, because he just touched on salts. Fertilizing with a synthetic fertilizer should also be done with care in that if you over-fertilize a tree, you won't necessarily know. It's going to give you the signs that it's being underwatered. You're going to say, the leaves are wilted and I watered the heck out of it. I don't know what's happening here. That's over-fertilization. That's basically the salt has collapsed the capillaries in the roots and it can't get water. All right? So be very, very careful when using synthetic fertilizers not to overdo it. That's another good reason why to use organics.
You were mentioning that you water some of them more than others at times.
Yep.
Doesn't that, don't you need enough water to get it to drain out the bottom of the pond?
Nope. No, you don't. Not every day. So that's not a bad idea, but you still, if I water this the same every day, no matter what, depending on how much foliage is on here, there's still going to be a saturation to the soil. There's still it doesn't drain out 100%. And the tree's needs change every day. So if you prune a tree, this is a great example. This tree needs way less water than the other one. Where is it? Than this one. Way less water. Because it doesn't have any foliage. Okay? This one at least has about 50% more foliage. So if you think of a plant almost like a candle wick. So the more foliage that it has, the more is transpiring off the leaf. Transpiration is sun hits this leaf, moisture evaporates from the leaf. And then to replace that moisture, the roots shoot more water into that leaf. They take it out of the pot. So that a three-sided pot with only the top open gets almost no evaporation. Nothing is pulling water from that soil. The wind's not doing it. So the only way that water is leaving is via transpiration. Okay? So if I were to water this tree exactly the same as I would water this tree or this tree will die. Or at least get very, very weak. Yeah. So I have to know, and with organic soil, it's awesome. I can just pick it up and say, all right, that's pretty heavy. I won't water that tomorrow. So, and to answer, another way to answer your question is, because you don't want to always necessarily skip watering a tree, because then your top roots might dry out and your bottom's still moist. So there's a way to hit equilibrium. If you know that you're still wet halfway down the pot, don't water the pot all the way through. Just walk by, get the soil, the surface wet, and that'll eventually hit equilibrium. Okay? So that's another way. I like to alter my water. A good way is water heavy, water light, water light, water heavy, water light, water light. Switch up your routine. But it's always based on how much foliage is on the tree. Always based on that and the soil it's in.
Do you have any experience with reclaimed water?
I don't.
Okay, we have reclaimed water, and we've done experiments where we can see some of the trees don't like it because it's high in nitrogen and phosphorus.
And that's, you are
And
going to find...
salts.
Huh?
And salts.
And salts, too.
And you're going to find that certain trees have much more finicky needs than others. Gardenias, like I was talking about earlier, really need high acidity, so they like acidity in the soil. What are some of the other things that they don't like? Azaleas also like acidity. Ixoras are a micronutrient nightmare. So there's certain trees that they're not impossible to use for bonsai, but yeah, you are going to have to think about things like what water you're using, what pH is the water. So not all trees are created equal. A sea hibiscus doesn't care. I mean, that'll grow in
Right.
a puddle of water, of any water.
The
So-
buttonwoods too. Our buttonwoods love it.
Yeah.
Like we have like literally 2 benches that are for the house water, and then the outside benches are for the reclaimed, because it's just so expensive for water. But reclaim costs almost nothing.
Right.
So we just break them up into where we're going to water.
I mean, honestly, if you saw how I water some of my trees, it might change your opinion a little bit. One of the things I do for super refined shohin trees is I have a big bucket of water that, after a month or two, looks more like a pond, and I take the whole tree and I submerge it in the water, okay, until all the air is worked out. That's the opposite issue. I have so many branches on the tree, it's so ramified that I can't, it needs every bit of water it's going to use throughout the day, every bit. During May, some of those trees, like the gardenia, need to be dumped twice because they have so many branches. But that's something I brought on myself. I decided to get a very expensive, well-ramified tree. So, yeah.
Do you make a point of not getting the foliage wet, getting it wet, doesn't matter?
Well, I don't want to say it doesn't matter, especially with broadleaf trees. Depending on the time of year, it can matter. It's not the end of the world if you get it wet, but those of us who've been doing bonsai for a few summers have probably noticed that some of our trees, when it gets wet on the foliage, can develop like a fungus and start to have issues with over wet foliage. So the only trees that like moisture on the leaves, that really like it, are conifers and evergreens. Yeah, they love it. That's how they absorb a lot of their waters, through the foliage. So that's a different beast. A Nerofolia does not want its foliage wet. So, but do I really think about that? Am I deliberate when I do it? No. I dip it in there. I'm like, I got the foliage wet.
I was thinking more of misting sometimes to kind of
I would not miss.
ever.
I would not miss broadleaf trees. It's almost, it doesn't do very much for them, as far as they don't take in. They maybe take in 5% of what you're spraying on them, whereas a conifer truly does absorb through the foliage. So all these things we've seen in the past of misting, that's conifers. That is a true technique, but for conifers.
Mike,
Yes.
are you using dirt or bonsai soil in your development phase?
So you can, ideally, you switch it to the appropriate soil and you develop in that soil first. It's like one of the first things you do. So you get the health up first, and sometimes repotting will make it healthier. Sometimes, like now, I'm not gonna repot this Premna just to get it in better soil because I know that we're gonna get cold and we're gonna have an issue and it's not gonna recover well. As soon as, if I wanna do this proper, as soon as we got warm enough, I'd repot this thing first into the appropriate soil in a big pot, and I'd let it run out and grow. Okay? How many of us have seen pictures of people building grow boxes for trees? So we've seen them build these wooden boxes where they get this new material and they put it in there, and that's what they're doing, is they're training the ground first, they're training the roots. So the majority of your tree, where you're really getting value out of your tree, the first thing that you're really buying is roots. That dictates everything else. Good roots make everything else way easier. So that's what we're going to talk about when we actually look at the material, which we're about to get into. To go back to the water real quick, that bucket that I use gets pretty mucky, pretty gross. The water does not seem to affect it in any negative way, but every tree is different. And I will say that even trees that you think can't be overwatered, a buttonwood, a cypress, they can be overwatered. A sea hibiscus, I have a sea hibiscus right now. I have one growing in a puddle. That's fine. Uses every bit of water I throw at it. And then I have one that's on the very cusp of death. If it gets one more drop of water, it's done for. And the reason being is that there's more to soil health than just being wet or not wet. There's anaerobics. There's anaerobics that happens there. The cypress trees we see in the groves that are growing in these ponds, that's moving water. It might not look like it, but that water is moving. Okay, it's not totally stagnant. Same with buttonwoods. Buttonwoods aren't usually growing in 100% stagnant water. Whereas in a pot, that's stagnant water. And if you have occluded drain holes or you have a mucky, muddy soil, now you have no oxygen in the soil. So water it as much as you want, it doesn't mean anything. You have no oxygen. So some trees, knowing proper watering technique in a container will help you get over these hurdles. Okay? Knowing what the tree wants. Why is it sad? It's almost always a watering issue. That's the first thing that precipitates other problems. Why does this tree always get pests? Because it's weak. because it needs to be properly, it needs to be super healthy, and you won't have as many health problems, as many pest problems. So it really is true that sometimes the Japanese almost look at us, sometimes when we do our bonsai, not Americans, but Westerners, and they see us beating our head against the wall, and they're like, it's not that hard. Just do it this way, and it will fall into place. You know, if you follow the discipline, you follow the regime, or the regimen, not the regime. Follow the regime. No, so if you follow the regimen, it will lead you to success. Now, I'm not going to say that the Japanese are the only school of thought out there, but we have to remember that we are doing, first and foremost, bonsai. Okay? Most of us join this club for the love of Japanese trees, and although there are other schools of thought, to cut your teeth so that you don't start embracing too many ideas, just focus on one for a while until you're confident and you're like, all right, I'm ready to venture out. Because that's another dangerous thing, is to pull too much information from too many different people, and then you're paralyzed. You're like, what do I do? So that's the purpose of this class, is to try and get us all at least on a single footing. You know, so we're all on equal footing, and we can go forward with our trees. And whether you continue to use my techniques or you venture out and do your own, that's fine too.
Yes, I have a great many mames that are jade, and one of my jades, however, is a larger tree, and she is Miss Ramification herself. And I've been told with my jades, I should probably not water them any more than I have to, that you can overwater them.
You absolutely can overwater a jade.
Yes.
The other issue is that as soon as you get into mame, so the horticulture becomes more difficult the smaller the pot size. Absolutely. So once you get into mame, you're dealing with very, very little room for error. And you're also dealing with a succulent. So you're dealing with a tree that already has a kind of a specific requirement to its watering, and then you're in a small pot. So that's a tricky one on knowing what to do to it, because you will need to water it more than most trees because it is in only this much soil, but also the jade can handle a lot of drying out. So keeping it alive shouldn't be difficult. That should be okay. Building ramification.
It's a larger tree, but it has you know, it's got lots of leaves, lots of ramification, and it just seems like it needs more water even than the mames do.
That could be true just because of the base of how much ramification it has, but I'd also have to see it. One thing that jades can do is when they're being overwatered, it will look like they're being underwatered. So the leaves get wrinkly and they fall off the very same way that they do when it's getting dry. So here's a good way to think of jades is, if you're ever worried about overwatering them, don't water them. I mean, that's really, you're not gonna ever underwater it to death, you know, unless you go away for a long period of time.
As in 3 months?
3 months, Catherine.
My daughter left, and she had her thing facing west on her lanai. 3 months later, I salvaged it.
Wouldn't
Still
leave
alive.
your dog for 3 months. Is it still alive?
Yeah, it's still alive.
Well, then never mind, I take it back. No. So, yeah, don't leave your, that's the other thing is, any time where you don't check your trees, like, the more you check on your trees, the more success you'll have doing this. So, things that I don't like, irrigation. So, drip irrigation, overhead irrigation, any kind of irrigation where you just hit a switch and you go to work. Okay, I know it's easy, and I know that we have busy lives, but you got to work it in. You got to work in the time to check the trees. Usually, if you were in Japan, you would be checking them in the morning. If you worked in a nursery, you'd be checking them in the afternoon, and you'd be checking them in the evening. Okay, so that you build a plan for the next day. It is just like, if you want to have super refined quality trees, it is just like having a pet. You can't afford to forget a day. You can't. I've been going out every single day, unless I have a watcher, for the last 10 years and hand watering every single tree I have. For 10 years. Haven't missed a day. There hasn't been a day I've forgotten. There hasn't been a day where, I didn't get up and do it. Every single day. And I don't have the greatest trees, but I'm very happy with the progress that they've made. And I don't think I would have gotten there if I would have just been doing it as I've thought of it. Okay? The other thing I'll tell you is a cautionary tale is I've gone to people's houses and I've worked on trees for them, okay? And the work that I do can only be successful if the horticulture is held up. So if we cut back a branch hard and the horticulture doesn't match up, if you continue to water heavy, then the tree won't react in the way that it's supposed to, and then we have a hard time building the design that we envisioned. So it is all, it's all connected. You can't do one without the other. You've got to have good horticulture to move to the next step. So good horticulture always starts first. So I think, is everybody ready to move towards the plant material? Start talking more about that. I think we can do
Can I
that.
ask you one more question?
Sure, you can ask as many as you
So all
want.
your trees you have, you know, we're kind of getting to a point where space is becoming an issue.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, isn't that funny? So how much space would be ideal between trees?
So the ideal amount of space between trees is probably like that. Ideally. I know it's hard to see, but it's hard to say. I can't say like a measurement because it's all based off of the canopy.
Okay, we're
Like,
still good then.
yeah, so you need to have ideally good airflow, good sunlight. So those are the two things you really only need. Good airflow, good sunlight. But what happens is if you cramp them together like this, that's when you get mold on the leaves. That's when you start to get issues with the foliage. That's when things stay too wet. Now, bonsai is a game of problem solving, so how can this be useful to us? This is something we just noticed about plants. If you group them together, they use less water. How can that help us?
Less water.
Less water. If we go away, if we go out of town, what are some ways, let's say we needed to go out of town, we absolutely had to. We couldn't do anything, we couldn't find somebody to watch our trees. What could we do? What are some of the ways we could solve that problem?
Put them in the shade.
Put them in the shade is one. We're going for a long time. What do we do?
Clean together.
Irrigation's one, but even easier.
Big
Plant them in
barrels
the
of
ground.
water, right? The big buckets of water.
You can
or
do
the
that,
big,
or even just
pots.
up pot them.
Yeah,
Put them in a big
Put them in the
pot.
ground.
Put them in the ground. Defoliate them. Group them together.
Make friends with
Put them in the
neighbors.
shade. So there's all kinds of ways to solve this problem. There's all kinds of ways to solve this problem. And just because you up pot a tree for 3 weeks doesn't mean that you can't just pull it right out of that pot and put it back in your little pot. Okay? So there are always workarounds, and that's what bonsai is. It doesn't matter what soil you're growing in. It's just people have noticed over the years and years and years that, hey, we can do this easier. This is easier. This just makes it less guessing. So that's why we do what we do, is that people have come before us and said, hey, there's an easier way to do this. Let me show you how we've done it. So let me move these trees out of the way.
That's a European olive?
It is.
Okay, so, because you were talking about it could take water every 7 days, but like a black olive, you couldn't do that.
No. So that's a good point, is a black olive and a European olive have two opposite, I need that one, two opposite foliage requirements. A black olive likes to stay pretty moist. You know, they don't like to dry out completely, probably closer to a buttonwood horticulturally. A black olive is very dry loving. They grow in like places like California, the Mediterranean, Italy, Spain, areas where they're not getting rainforest amounts of water. Okay? So if you can't always base your horticultural knowledge on the common name too, that's a good lesson. Is it's called a black olive. It has nothing to do with olives. Nothing. It's a Busita. So it's like closer to our shady ladies we see and stuff like that. So let me get this.
Can I just ask a question about
Yeah,
that?
sure.
When I lived in Fort Lauderdale,
Mhm.
they called all the ones that you put in your yard black olives. Are they more related to that?
No, the
Because-
black olive. No, this is the black olives that you put in your yard are Busitas.
Are
So,
Busitas?
Yep.
Right,
So
and this is European.
European olive. Yep.
European, okay.
So European olive is something that's does really, really well here, but you do have to keep things in mind. Like come rainy season, what's one way, this is a good lesson, what's one way in rainy season, since I'm in that pot, let's say I don't repot it, what's one way that I could combat overwatering? Umbrella, sure. But there's one answer that's the easiest answer.
Put it in an angle.
Put it in different soils.
To do that, or just don't prune it. Don't work on it. Don't cut more foliage off. Grow as much foliage as you can. Right, so that it transpires much. There is no way in hell I'm overwatering this tree. It's not happening. I could dump on this tree all day with the hose and I'm not overwatering it. A, because it's a sea hibiscus, and B, because it has shoots out to here and it's using as much as I can give it. Okay? So there's no way, I don't have to worry about that tree. So it's totally different. The olive, if I had shoots out to here, I wouldn't be worrying about overwatering it either. I'd be watering it every day. So it's just knowing how to read the tree. I have a lot of foliage, I need to water more. I don't have a lot of foliage, I need to water less. So I'm in thick soil, I need to water less. I'm in very coarse soil, I need to water more. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it's just weighing these variables. So now I'm going to try the very difficult task of working one-handed. No, it'll be fine. Is there a tree we want to start talking with? A species we want to talk about first? Just check my notes.
Primnook, I don't know how to grow that. Is this
Yeah,
primnook?
Yeah.
Nerfolia.
All right, Nerfolia. The tried and true. Okay. Oh, so then we'll move our other guys out of the way.
And you said they don't like the leaves to get watered.
They do not like wet leaves. No, sir. They do not.
What are those native to, Nerfolias?
That's a very good question that many people have argued for a long time. Apparently, like the way I've heard it is Joe Samuels got a cutting at a nursery that they didn't know where it was from, and Joe Samuels continued to propagate it, and that's where we got all the Nerfolias we have. It was just a lucky nursery find, was the way I heard it. So whether that's the actual story, I'm not sure, and I'm sure it does come from somewhere, but most people can't even agree on what the Latin term is for this. So
How many varieties of Nerfolia are there?
I've only seen, oh, no, that's not true. There are at least 2 that I know of. So there's the 89, the variety 89 they call it. And then I've seen this one. There's also an in-between that's called a Ficus exotica. That's very similar to the species. But
I'd like to get one with smaller leaves.
I mean, they reduce pretty well, but you just gotta keep up at them. And once
the shit out of them, they ain't reduced.
No, but you gotta, so that's the thing. That's another good thing to talk about is small leaf only comes after you have a ton of branches, like a ton of branches. And that's because the energy has to be divided more and more and more and more. It's actually, the small leaf isn't always necessarily what people are looking for when they're growing bonsai. It is literally just symptomatic of the fact of having so many branches. Yes?
Water on the leaves, is that typical of all ficus or just Nerfolia?
I mean, Nerfolia is going to be the most, the one that's going to seem to develop the most problems with it, but I've seen it happen to rain trees, I've seen it happen to water jasmine, I've seen it happen to anything really dense that's going to hold water in these like little nets, okay? So anything like that. So other ficus, I haven't seen it a problem at Retusa, haven't really seen it as a problem on Green Island, but that's also, they're very thick leaves. Very thick rubbery leaves, so I don't think they're as delicate. So keep that in mind as well.
Okay.
So approaching these 2 trees, I had the chance to kind of go through the nursery and look at material. And so one of the things we were doing today was how to pick appropriate material. Now, there's nothing wrong with either of these trees, but we're trying to play a game of efficiency. We're not just trying to make a good tree, we're trying to make a good tree without spending 50 years doing it. Okay? If you had to spend 6 years versus 3 years, you'd rather spend 3 years to build a nice tree. Okay? So our game isn't necessarily just to pick a good tree, but to pick a tree that has the most that we can use versus what we're cutting off. So, you know, a tree that we trunk chop, that can still be a good tree, but now you have to grow everything back. Whereas if you just found a tree that had branches where you wanted them, there you go, you just saved yourself a ton of time. So, out of these 2 trees, I kind of did have some time to look at them, and I kind of already made up my mind. What do you guys think I'm going to pick?
One on the,
You're like,
This one?
They start out at the same price.
This one?
Do they start out at the same price?
I don't know. Let me see. Yeah, they're the same price. Yeah. So you guys like the fat trunk one?
No, I like this one.
I like the one.
I like this
I
one.
think we're 50-50.
This is the one I like.
Yes.
Okay? A big trunk doesn't necessarily mean anything. A big trunk, you can grow a big trunk all day. That means nothing. That takes very little skill to grow a big trunk. Half the trees you'll find in the landscape have a big trunk. Okay? The art is in the branching, the taper, the way it's presented. Okay? This has a lot more to work with today and a lot fewer problems to correct than this tree.
Yes.
So let's talk about some of these problems, okay? So one of the first problems I see is that almost all of our branches are coming from one point at the top. We have 4 branches right in a row, like that, okay?
Yeah.
So bare minimum, we gotta take 2 of those away, and we're left with a very reverse tapered Y, okay? Or maybe we're left with that. I don't know. Neither one's visually pleasing. So that's issue number 1. So we'd have to cut that back and create 2 very large wounds, okay, that we'd then have to heal and replace the branches we cut off. First problems. That's the problems. That's not even the most important problems. Where we should always look first is at the roots, all right? Because that's going to be issues that cannot be corrected. Those are issues that are much harder to be corrected, I should say, not can't. I'm not a big fan of aerial roots, and I can even take that a step further. If you have aerial roots, there's a tasteful way to have them and a way that's less tasteful. Best aerial roots grow off branches, okay? They grow off of the branch, not off the trunk, so they don't grow off the trunk at an angle down to the soil. They grow off the branch down. And then over time they thicken and they fuse with the main trunk and you get a bigger trunk, just like a true banyan tree, all right? Now in Japan, aerial roots of any kind are definitely discouraged because aerial roots have one fundamental issue that goes against everything else we want in bonsai. What is it? Does anybody know? Nope, or almost.
Reverse taper?
Reverse taper, there you go. So anywhere you have an aerial root on the tree, anywhere, you're going to get reverse taper. For some people, it's not an issue. You know, for naturalists, a lot of the Chinese artists, some of the guys from Indonesia, things like that, they'll argue, they'll say, that's how ficus grow. You know, they grow with reverse taper. And that's fine. I can respect that. That's good. But I don't like, even if you're going to go the aerial root route, I don't like them coming off the trunk at an angle. So that's another thing that I would have to correct here. All right? And then ideally, now in this stage of the game, I would be looking for a tree that has radial rootage, a radial nabari, where it has 360-degree roots going all the way around, or one that I can easily add that onto. All right? With a ficus, it's very easy to fix the roots, so that's not as big of an issue as I was saying on the top, for once. Usually it is the roots are the bigger issue. So this guy, we're going to disregard. It's not a bad tree, but we just don't at the time. So we'll disregard him.
This
How do you
one.
fix the roots?
Good question. So one thing that you'll see in Japan is if you don't like roots, let me talk about this guy because he's a little maybe easier to see. This tree has like a big, ugly, knobby root coming up at the surface that we can all see. Okay? That one strong root isn't a good nabari. A good nabari is a flaring circular mat of roots, and one way that you can get it, that you'll see these guys in Japan do, is called a ground layer. How many people know what an air layer is? How many people don't know what an air layer is? All right, so an air layer is basically if we have a tall tree and we want to make 2 trees, we score the surface in the middle of the tree, we apply sphagnum moss, and we wrap it with saran wrap or plastic, and we grow new roots. And then we cut that tree off and we plant that as its own tree. So we get 2 trees. All right? Well, that same technique of scoring and applying moss or a rooting medium like soil, if you do that at the base of the tree, right above your ugly roots, on a lot of species, it will give you a 360-degree root plate that then you can grow out and develop into way better root mass, right? Better nabari. So this is the kind of stuff that instead of fixing, it's better to just buy one that has it. See what I'm saying? So yeah, exactly. Things like this, or start with young material where you can oversee the growth of the roots. Because the way this happens is that when we don't check roots on young material, we allow one root to get too strong, and the tree has no reason to push other roots. So you get like 3 roots that are very strong, and they're not radial. Usually 2 on one side, 1 on another. That's not a quality nabari. Okay? That's getting you by. So this Premna has a pretty good, it's not perfect, but when you guys get a chance, come up and look at that, and you'll see that this was a cutting done with the ground layering, and it's got pretty radial roots, like There's still some that got a little crossed, and this was still when I was learning this technique. So the next batch going to be way better.
So when you're air layering, we do it about an inch, inch and a half all around the cambium. But when you're doing ground layering, how deep is that cut?
So you want to put your top cut wherever you want your roots to be at.
Right.
That needs to be your top cut.
Okay.
So because that's where you're gonna be cutting off right underneath that.
Okay. So it's the same process, basically.
Same process.
Okay.
Yeah. But you want to do it keeping in mind, like if you only have this much room until you get to your branch or where you want your roots to be, then you just have to make a thin line.
Okay.
So you're not doing one of the reasons why we do a wide cut on normal air layers is we don't want it to refuse. We're not as worried about that on a ground layer. So that's one thing that we can correct. So roots on a ficus, roots on a sea hibiscus, we're not too worried about as far as fixing. Now I want to preface this by saying, today is not the day to do any heavy work on tropicals, unless you're going to do the work to make sure that they stay happy. And sometimes it's a lot of work. If I cut this back and I head this in, and I leave it out in 40-degree temperatures, do you really think that new bud that's coming out is really going to love 40-degree temperatures?
No.
It doesn't matter if it's a pine, a juniper, any of that. Fresh growth does not like cold temperatures. Fresh growth on any tree. Okay? Doesn't matter if it's a pine. Doesn't matter if it's a juniper. If it's brand new growth, it can burn off. So you want to make sure that that does not see temperatures under 55 degrees if you're going to do that kind of work. So a lot of times, I tell my students this all the time in my classes. I say, hey, this is going to be a lot of extra work. Are you up for it? And they say, yeah. And then 3 weeks later, I get the dreaded text with the picture saying, what happened to my tree? And I say, you didn't bring it in, did you? I may have forgot once or twice. Well, that's, that
Once
can
or
really
twice
set you back.
enough.
Yeah, so it's not me just being mean when I say that kind of stuff. I mean, it is serious stuff. If you do the work this time of year, you have to protect it because that can kill the tree. So one of the things that I do want to talk about is this tree also is the design as far as, do we need to cut it back? This tree can be styled in numerous different ways. And again, no way is right or wrong. It's just about what's going to save us the most time. So the design that's going to save us the most time, honestly, is if we do a clump, a forest, okay? Like that, and we style each of these trees as a tree. You're a naysayer. You're a naysayer. But listen, I'm telling you. The other thing we could do is make a shohin out of this, which is my favorite thing to do, which I'm starting to get the look like maybe we should do that. So,
You got some low branches.
no, I know I have some low branches, but sometimes it's also better. Let's talk about the issues with making it a shohin versus a forest.
Yeah.
Nerifolias are not great healers, okay? They take a long, long time to heal, even with cut paste, even with proper techniques. And then the branch you'll use to heal your wound will get to the size of the branch you cut off by the time you heal it, and you'll just make another wound. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Like they heal at such a slow rate that it's very difficult to get the wound closed. It takes a very long time. So if we're making a shohin, then we need to consider that. Is it going to be worth opening up a big wound to lower the tree down to that level? And I'm not saying it's not going to be. Maybe it is. But we should explore other options. You should explore the name of the game is being the most efficient artist possible. Again, like if you wanted a short Nerifolia, find a shorter Nerifolia, or just be prepared to heal one for a long time.
Work with the tree, not against it.
Yeah. Don't try to make a weeping bougainvillea. It's very hard. Now, we've had one of those at the nursery, and it was a nightmare. We had to wire it every year to try and keep it weeping, and it was just easier to not weep it. So I'm trying to determine if I want to cut this or not.
How many trunks are there? One, three.
No more.
There are technically 6 trunks right now. So what I'm looking at is whether it's going to be worth it, like if the trunks have enough interest to make a quality forest, or whether it is better to just trunk chop it. Sometimes it is better to just chop it, and I've made several successful trees doing that. But the issue, it can clearly be seen even on this tree, is that I've been growing this tree for probably 7 years now, and it still has the wounds that I made when I trunk chopped it. Okay? Now, I could do things a little differently to encourage that. I could stop pruning it and just let it run out for 2 years, and maybe that would help. But again, you're going to be cutting off branches that create the same size wound you healed. So it's kind of a tricky thing. The issue with making this a forest is that the trunks are very, very straight, and they do lack any kind of realistic taper to them. It's very, very slow taper. So I would say the first thing I would do, maybe not now, if this was my tree, I wouldn't even do it now. I'd wait until we get through winter and I do my hard cuts. But I'm willing, since I'm the one watching them, if you guys want me to cut it back today, I can, and that'll give us a little bit of a head start when we go into the development class next time. So.
Cut. We're gonna put you to work.
Get it a baby blanket.
Fine.
You got 4 trees though, I mean, it's up to you.
No, I know.
Right, I mean, you got-
to work on.
You got 3 trees to sell.
Got plenty to work on. So I'm just gonna set the microphone down briefly. Okay. I'm gonna look at it this way so that you guys can see what I'm doing.
Yeah, have you determined the front?
I have.
The front?
So I determined the front. This is the front that I've determined versus our 2 other possibilities. That is the back side of the tree, which has several things that we would need to get rid of in order to make this viable. Okay.
Cuttings.
Cuttings, exactly. Exactly. So when I do this kind of work, when I first got into bonsai, I used to be like, oh my God, I can't believe I got to cut this tree I just bought and I got to cut it to nothing. But nowadays, I honestly care less about the tree that I cut everything off of, and I'm really excited about cuttings. Because some of my best trees have been made by finding like a reverse taper on other trees. That's a great example. I just bought a Ficus retusa with aerial roots, and the aerial roots had made a lot of reverse taper in some of those areas. But when I cut right under that reverse taper, that gave me these big base cuttings that are going to make great shohin. Great shohin. I almost can't wait. I'm almost don't even need the tree now. So, so I'm very excited about that. So this will be good for cuttings. So one of the things we have to do when I first started working with him, I used to ask him, I said, so how do you know where to cut a tree? You know, when do you determine? And his answer still holds true to this day, is when the tree lacks movement or taper. Basically when the tree gets boring. Okay? There's 2 things that can make a tree interesting as far as bonsai, and that's having exciting movement or taper. And you have to have one or the other, preferably both. And if you have both, you're in good shape. But you have to have movement or taper. Examples of trees with just movement and no taper are like bunjin trees. Very cool. You know, they look like calligraphy. They don't need a lot of taper. They just rely on the movement. Trees that don't have a lot of movement but still look good are formal uprights. They don't have movement, they have a lot of taper, so they still look good. Okay? So when I look at this, I basically have to just take my eye and be as aggressive as possible now, or when I'm first starting the tree, and say, where does this trunk lose movement and taper? Okay? It doesn't have any movement, so we're relying on taper. And unfortunately, where it really starts to get boring, we can maybe stretch it to here, but realistically it's getting pretty boring down in here.
Right.
Okay? So we need to cut that and reintroduce taper to that design, stronger taper. So that's one of the first cuts. This one back here has no taper all the way to the top. So that we might only leave a few inches above the soil. Okay? And so on and so forth. Anywhere where we have a branch that lacks movement or taper. You know? So there are some things when you get into the smaller branches where you can fix the movement part, but you still have to cut back for taper. So you're not going to get away from that. There's no way to create taper in a tree. So, so I'm going to do the cutting.
Do we have a before picture?
You can take your before picture.
On that first cut you're talking about, could you leave that first branch and that would be your taper or no?
This
Would that be
one?
still too high? Yeah.
I mean, I feel it's probably still too high. I
okay.
think the ratio, so you could break it down into a mathematical ratio if you really wanted to look at it. Most commonly, people use 6 to 1. So 6 times the width of the trunk, you're going up. Now then you're going to get into weird shapes like these sumo stuff where you kind of have a gooseneck. Then I kind of go stronger. I'll usually do 2 to 1 or 1 to 1. So you see this base here, technically I could go twice that height, but I think I'd rather go 1 time that height, you know, and finish the tree 2 times that height.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So,
Finished product, yeah.
Finished product.
Well, that's what I was gonna ask you, so isn't it very dependent on how big of a tree or display you want?
To some degree, but you'll honestly have more success if you just, like, if I bought this tree, I wouldn't say to my tree, I wouldn't say to myself, I want a shohin, so I'm gonna make this a shohin.
No, I can understand that, but say you had agreed, or you had thought that you wanted a much bigger tree, then would you not have to cut back as much?
If you wanted a bigger tree, then you should, I mean, ideally, you'd find a tree that allowed you to get better proportion and still keep the height. So let me word it like this. Wanting a bigger tree of this will just mean you'll have a bigger, mediocre tree. Having a smaller tree will mean you'll have a smaller, higher quality tree. So one good example of that is a lot of, like, this is a good example. This is my little Premna. Again, this is a fun tree. I like this tree a lot. This had trunks that were coming out to here. This was about this tall when I bought this tree. Okay? The trunks that came out of it were perfectly straight. Perfectly straight. So if I would have built my tree on that big, perfectly straight one, and I said, I want this to be a bigger tree, I would have never gotten further than ever just having a big, mediocre tree.
Okay.
But by sacrificing the boring parts of the tree and just distilling it down to what was interesting on the tree, the base was the only thing interesting on it. The rest was boring as heck. I grew my tree on top of that focal point, and now I've got a nice, higher quality small tree.
Okay.
So sometimes you have to sacrifice a good tree to make a great tree. Like if I wanted to make this a great tree, I should take it out of this pot, put it back in development, not have it the way it is, and I need to fix everything that's wrong with it, but I'll lose this tree right there. How it is now, it'll never be that way again. But sometimes it's better to sacrifice a mediocre tree and risk everything and go for a great tree. Like there's been times where I've cut trees back where I thought, ooh man, I'm cutting this back so hard that I might kill the tree. I might, but if it lives, it's gonna be world-class material. And sometimes that's the kind of force you're approached with in bonsai, where you're like, ooh, do I risk this to get a great tree or just settle with a pretty good tree? You know? So a lot of times, size means nothing for quality. Size means absolutely nothing.
Can you graft that permanent?
Yeah, you can graft Premna all the time. Premna, most of our tropicals take grafts very, very easily, and that's something that as you get better and better at bonsai, that is a tool you will use extensively to fix all sorts of things. Root issues, refining the bases on trees. Even if your tree started with good roots, there's ways to add roots in, where you're like, oh, you know what, this needs another root. And you can add one in by grafting. So there's a lot of techniques we can do to refine and better these trees and literally get them as close to perfection as possible.
I've seen that with the rooting. They take seedlings or saplings or whatever, and they drill through the root on the Nabari.
Yep.
Should we turn off that?
I'm like,
Move it to the next table.
to the table, yeah.
Sounded like an earthquake.
That's what Jim Van Landingham does. Am I right? Okay.
And Huggy branches.
Yeah. He, every single thing I've ever seen him do,
Yep.
especially to a ficus, he'll do exactly what Mike said. He'll get to it, he'll look at it, he'll say where it stops being interesting, he cuts it, and when he's done with the tree, it literally is just three, like, trunks.
And it's
then
not
nothing
always
left.
this way. Like, it's not always this way, but some trees,
Seriously,
this
wow.
is what I mean by some trees are gonna have the stuff where you don't have to do this work. You know, but if you
Right.
wanna get taper and stuff like that, then you have to introduce it at some point. This is why, like, there is a market, that's why pre-bonsai exists, is that something where ideally, you know, you have something that's already been cut back like this. Like this would be a good pre-bonsai. This isn't a bonsai yet. This isn't ready for a trunk or anything. This is still very much in development, but this is a tree that you could walk up to and buy and not have to cut it in half. You know?
Yeah.
Otherwise, if you're starting with raw stock, and it doesn't matter about what nursery you go to or anything, it has to matter with the time. Like this kind of care given to a pre-bonsai is almost cost prohibitive. Like you'd have to sell this for $300 to make it worth your while to grow a bunch of them and look at them every day and do what you need to do. So a lot of times, it's better for us as practitioners, you know, to have somebody just grow it in bulk, and then we fix it when we buy it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So, because otherwise we'd never, you know, except the very rich, we wouldn't be able to afford the bonsai. Bonsai in Japan, like for shohin, they go up to 20 grand for high quality shohin. So I'm not buying that, so I gotta make it. If I want it, I gotta make it.
Being winter, even though you've now promised to keep this warm or temperature neutral as much as possible, how fast would you expect it to start trying to push?
So this time of year, I expect it to grow somewhat slowly, but I think that by our next meeting, it should be, which our next meeting is only in a
March?
month. No, don't we have, in March? Okay, that should be enough to at least have some shoots like this off of it, coming off of it.
It'll bring them to the steady root.
Oh yeah, I can do that too. Yeah.
And where you cut these flush like that, they will push out a zillion little shoots right along the edge of the cambium,
They will.
and you have to just make a selection as
You
to
ha-
what to keep.
That's it. So nerifolias can be very confusing because they do just push out in like a big cluster.
Yeah.
And that's one of the first flaws I see when people approach that material. It's super easy. You have to just take the time and just select 1 or 2 branches from each one of those pods of exploding branches. Just go and cut everything else out and pick 1 or 2. And the tree will start putting the vigor into those, and they'll get thicker before you know it. You know, it's the only way. You have to limit it down. Otherwise, I've seen nerifolia that are 10 years old with 1 million branches coming from one point, and none of them are of any thickness.
Yeah.
None of them. They just look like a big bunch of hair coming out. And so, so you have to kind of focus in on certain branches to get any kind of thickness on those. And these are all great cuttings. This is all stuff that I would root, and if nobody takes it, I
Raffle?
will root it.
Raffle.
So, but technically,
Catherine's got it.
Catherine's the cutting queen. She's made some amazing trees. Now, here's another very important tool.
The cut paste.
Cut paste.
Can you use it on those?
Yes.
I use it on everything. I use it on jades. I use it on everything.
Oh, I didn't like that, I meant, because eventually, will you cut those more? as you're
Sure.
doing-
Sure.
But still, you're going to.
Well, it's also about health. It's also about keeping the tree. So right now, imagine if you have a hose, right? And you put a hole right in the side of it and you're trying to water. What's happening at the end of the hose? You're losing a lot of pressure, right?
Okay.
You're like, why isn't this working? Well, the same thing happens if we just leave this as an open cut. We're losing moisture at the top.
Right.
We are losing moisture. So worst case or best case scenario, we get dieback down the trunk and we start lower than we would have. Worst case scenario, we actually lose a portion of that trunk, like a good 2 inches of it. So dieback in the winter. So she's right. We are going to be recutting these, but I want to keep them sealed, keep the tree happy, and encourage it to push.
But just where you cut, you don't wanna overdo that stuff, right? Cause you want it to be pushing.
Oh, it'll
out.
push through that.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Of course, now you just reintroduced your germs to it by licking your finger.
Oh.
No, I know somebody else who does that, and it drives me crazy
I'm not worried
because
about my germs.
what is in there? That's the part. You guys kill me when you do that.
I think it tastes good.
He's addicted.
Let me guess,
actually.
you ate,
That's the nurse practitioner in me.
Let me
That
guess, you ate
bothers me.
Play-Doh
Can
as a
you read
child,
that
right?
Japanese? Do you know what's in there?
I know that it says, the new one says 15%. I don't know of what.
do you ever use duck seal?
Sure, yeah.
I just dip in water with my finger and I spread it.
So do you want me to hold off on the next work? I'm just gonna
Yeah,
paste
just
it.
go ahead and do the cut paste on that. We're gonna take
Yeah, I
a
use that
break
too.
now. Lynette is gonna talk a little bit about the auction, and then again, those of you that didn't get your holiday gift, see me in the back when Lynette is finished, please.
This won't take long. Everyone should